Kyle Clark joined 9 News in 2007, moving here from his native New York. We see him every evening co-anchoring with Kim Christensen on the 9 p.m. newscast that airs over Channel 20 under the brand of KUSA 9 News. Kyle also does a lot of reporting and anchoring on breaking news and major stories in Colorado. For example, he was on the air for 17 hours continuously, 17 hours at the time of the tragic Aurora Theater shootings last summer. Another example was his on-scene reporting from one of last year's most devastating wildfires, the High Park fire on Poudre Canyon west of Fort Collins. Many other stories that he's covered here in Denver, too numerous to mention. Kyle's reputation spread nationally when he questioned President Obama unsparingly on the failure of solar subsidies and the Benghazi attacks during last year's campaign. Kyle Clark is an equal opportunity, aggressive, dig out the story journalist. Not only did he grill Obama about Benghazi, but also during last year's campaign, it was he who tracked down Congressman Mike Coffman, Republican, and insisted on some answers about Coffman's controversial remarks criticizing President Obama. You're going to find Kyle Clark shooting it straight right down the middle. This is what we need more in news, especially television news. I mentioned he's a New York native, the western part of the state. He attended Ithaca College out there. He was doing TV news in Rochester, New York, before coming here. Going over his bio on the website this morning, I was fascinated to find that while still in high school, just at age 15, he landed a job in radio, local radio. Not making this up, WACK radio. He went on to WHAM television. I guess, Kyle, when you got to Denver and found that your new employer had call letters that spelled something, KUSA, it was both familiar to you, but also a relief that it's something you could say without getting a laugh. We're just delighted that as his busy day getting ready for being on the air at 9 this evening, will start about 2 o'clock, that he's been able to take some time here with us to take CCU and Centennial Institute inside a TV newsroom. Please welcome Kyle Clark of 9 News.
Hey folks, so the senator asked me to come and chat with you guys about media literacy, and I thought, well, I could get up here and I could talk about media literacy for 30 minutes, and then we could do 30 minutes of Q&A about media bias, or I could just cut to the chase and talk about media bias, and then we could do 30 minutes of Q&A about media bias. So, if you don't mind, we're just going to start and end with the media bias. If you have other media questions, including the workings of a newsroom or careers in TV and so forth, feel free to ask those questions as well in the Q&A, and I would be happy to address those. But the bottom line is, as a journalist, I don't get a ton of invitations to speak before crowds of conservatives. But John assures me that several journalists have come and gone from this room without harm. So I don't believe this to be a trap.
That's what we wanted you to think.
I understand. And how could I pass up the invitation to come before you and defend a news media that you see as morally bankrupt, hopefully biased, intractably un-American, and antithetical to all of your deeply held beliefs? This is a pleasure for me to come and do that. So, before we get into the question, answer, personal insult phase, which will be much more interesting than my comments themselves, I do want to kind of outline media bias as I see it, which I'm guessing will be very different from media bias as you see it, and then also talk about the way that we can go about fixing it. Because I think that we share the blame for this. Not me, not you personally. I am blameless myself. And I'm sure that all of you are blameless as well. But let's just say people I know and people that you know are the problem. So, we're going to fix it here today, or nobody leaves the room. This is a good time for the disclaimer that I'm here speaking only for myself. I'm not speaking for 9 News, its parent company Gannett, our affiliate NBC, or MSNBC. So, we'll get out there. I got a good shh from that. That's good. That's good. The other thing that I need to acknowledge right off the bat, I don't know how much you guys see and read this, but folks on the other side of the political spectrum, not so much moderate Democrats, but more on the progressive side, they are as devoutly convinced that the media is biased against them as you are convinced that the media is biased against you. So, a lot of what I'm saying kind of can be spoken to 2 camps. I'll attempt to tailor my message to you folks, but the bottom line is this is very similar to remarks that I've given to progressive organizations that want to know why the media is so hopefully biased toward the right, toward the status quo, toward big business, and so on and so forth. And by instance, I think both sides are right. I mean, we've all seen interviews where it's clear that the reporter is just dripping with contempt for the interview subject. The person can't even get out questions in a forthright manner without showing obvious contempt. I've seen that for both conservative and progressive voices. People being dismissed out of hand before they even answer a question. And I've seen a lot of reporting that's also dismissive of deeply held beliefs and causes that are important to people on both the left and the right. I think on the right, oftentimes, it tends to be a dismissal of beliefs centered around faith. The idea that, oh, well, if you're going to give me a faith-based reason for that, I'm going to take the microphone away. Whereas on the left, you tend to see a dismissal of causes like poverty or inequality in schools as, well, that's too intractable to deal with, so let's focus on the issue at hand. And that really ticks off progressive. So I see both of those. The other thing that I need to add as a caveat before we get going is the power of confirmation bias. The idea that you will see whatever you are looking to see. If you don't believe this, pick a color and tell me how many cars of that color you see by the end of the day. If you are looking for them, you will find them. Again, this is an asterisk, not an explanation, but that always has to figure into our thinking whenever we're looking at something like media bias. Here's the other thing about media bias. I have a stack of emails, I've saved them because they're hysterical, asking me why 9 News never questioned President Obama about Benghazi. I have a smaller stack of emails, but emails nonetheless, that are people's responses to me when I send them a copy of my story where I questioned the president about Benghazi and it made national news. This smaller stack of responses goes something like, well, why'd you cover up the video and never air it? Okay? So, again, there has to be some plane of reasonableness on which the discussion is conducted. Last month, I did a couple of stories, 2 days worth, on the comments made by Democratic Representative Joe Salazar of Thornton. He was the one who came out on the floor debate and suggested that if college women have guns, they'll make hysterical decisions and just shoot people because they think they're being attacked. So we have people that have sent us feedback, commented to us about the fact that we did not cover Representative Salazar's comments. They have made those comments in the comment section of my story about Representative Salazar. So, and if you're saying, well, those people sound like outliers, they don't sound like the more reasoned voices, I will tell you, they are the majority of the voices that we hear on the issue of media bias in the 9 newsroom. So one of the things I want to talk about today is the idea of how we start a reasonable dialogue about this issue so that the people representing newsrooms aren't fringe outliers and the people representing your point of view are not fringe outliers. Because again, when you tell me that I never questioned the president about Benghazi, there's only so much reasoning that can happen between the two of us. I'm going to let you in on a secret. And my former colleague Don Brookins of KUSA, decades of service, wave Don, knows this well. He will attest to this. He's my second on this. There are more liberals than conservatives in newsrooms. If I was holding the mic, this is where I drop it. Okay. That is in terms of the places that I've worked. I can't speak for other newsrooms I haven't worked in. I've worked in 4 or 5. That goes for every newsroom that I've ever worked in. And I have some ideas about why that might be, but I don't think that that's what we're really here to talk about today. That could be a separate topic for another time in terms of why people pick the professions that they do. But my point is, it shouldn't matter if people are doing their jobs with any type of self-respect, because they're not there to provide their own opinion, their own perspective, their own commentary, short of their own observations about what's going on. And observations are key. We'll hear all the time, just the facts, just the facts. Well, you can get the facts anywhere. I need somebody who is a skilled observer to explain the nuance and the context and this kind of thing. That's different from opinion. Nobody gives a rat's behind what my opinion is, but they want my perspective on the situation at hand. The other thing is that any self-respecting journalist understands that inserting your own political bias into a story or into coverage should be grounds for termination. Does that happen? Not often. But again, we go back to this idea of people's own personal responsibility for the way they conduct themselves in their job. I'm not here to tell you that there aren't hacks. There are hack journalists. There are hack mechanics, hack nurses, and hack politicians as well. There's going to be a certain amount of that in any profession. So I think we have to look at the overall scope of things as opposed to fixating on certain people or certain issues and saying, well, that person is the problem. Well, when you spend 5 years getting that person out of their job, you're going to find that you haven't fixed the problem. You've just gotten one person out of their job. So it's better to kind of address the issue as a whole. I should also say I'm not one of those journalist absolutists that believes that journalists should not vote. There are people in our industry that believe that journalists should be so impartial that they should not vote, which I respect. I shouldn't say that. I don't know that I respect people who say that. I think that's wacky. I think that's really honestly wacky, because I didn't renounce my citizenship to become a journalist, and I spend all day long researching these topics and researching the politicians. Why shouldn't I vote? I mean, if nothing else, I cancel out somebody who voted because of the color of a yard sign. So like, I will gladly vote. So I'm not in the camp of people who believe that. I think the key here is that journalists need to recognize their personal biases and actively work to counteract them every day. I think that it's absolutely critical that journalists do a mental check at the beginning of every single story to say, what am I bringing into the room on this? What do I think about this? Because then you instantly know that you're going to have to spend at least twice as much time familiarizing yourself with the other side of the story so that you can accurately present that side of the story. Any journalist that looks at an issue and goes, well, I kind of know, I know this argument, that makes sense to me, but the other one doesn't make sense to me. Well, either those other people are insane or you need to educate yourself more about the issue. And it starts with that mental checkoff of, this is what I believe, which has no place in my reporting, and here are the people that I need to get in touch with so that I understand where they're coming from. If my beliefs are so strongly held on any one issue that I cannot put it aside, then I have an obligation to go to my editors and say that. Again, unless you're dealing with a very small shop where you're literally a one-person operation, and the only one-person journalism operation in town is Pete. So it doesn't work for Pete, but it works for everybody else. You have to go to your editor and say, put somebody else on this. I can cover another story. Have I done this before? Yes, absolutely. Not on political issues, because I think that I'm perfectly capable of putting my own political biases aside and covering issues fairly. However, when the craft beer bill comes up at the Capitol every year, the one about can you sell craft beer in supermarkets, what would that do to the craft beer industry, I recuse myself from that discussion. I'm a home brewer, I'm a craft beer advocate, and I cannot cover that issue fairly. I truly think one side is insane. So I have no place covering that story. So for several years in a row, and what will happen is that my bosses will come to me and they'll say, we want to put you on that story because you know about craft beer. And every year I tell them the same thing, which is, I don't think that I can be fair. So they say, okay. And they hand it to somebody else. And quite often that person will come to me and say, help me understand your side of things. And I'll give it to them. And I'm happy to play that role. But it's not my place to cover that story because I can't set aside my personal beliefs on it. In the 9 newsroom, And Don, don't you pull a Joe Wilson and yell, "You lie" at me. But I don't see an overt spoken bias toward one political party or the other. I do see types of bias that present themselves as that and as other things in non-political stories. And I want to kind of walk through some of those. I see a bias toward power, I see a bias toward personality, and I see a bias toward progress. And I have to put progress in quotation marks, because what is progress? Well, progress is change that you like. Change that you don't like is not progress. They are not synonyms. And I think that gets to a lot of the beef that you guys rightfully have about what you see in the media, and also how you can be a force to get your side of things more accurately portrayed in the media. I think that too many journalists got into journalism because they enjoy being around powerful people, because they enjoy being popular with powerful people. I think this goes not only for politics, I think it goes for sports. I think it goes for business. I think there is a deference to power that does not suit journalism well. That said, the people who think that journalists' job are to just kind of be a constant thorn in the side of powerful people, I don't understand how that's your job either. Your job should be to give those folks a fair shake and people with opposing viewpoints a fair shake, and then let it come out in the wash. But I think that there is this adoration of power, and I think you see it on both sides of the aisle. I mean, how many people, show of hands in this room, think that most journalists hate Dick Cheney? Okay. There are exceptions to the rule. I would tell you that most face-to-face interviews that I've seen with Dick Cheney have been tremendously deferential to him. And I think it's power. Because if you're correct, I don't know that you are, if you're correct that most journalists hate Dick Cheney, you would think there'd be a lot more in-your-face interviews with Dick Cheney. But I think it's a power thing. The other thing, too, is that the idea of challenging power should be requisite with the job. I got some emails, not a ton of them, but some of them after my interview with President Obama, where people essentially said, "How could you speak to him like that?" To which my response was, how could I not speak to him like that? I asked him simple, fair, direct questions, and I allowed him to speak uninterrupted until he was done speaking. That's how it's supposed to work. The idea that I ask him what's on his iPod and he gives me a few answers and we laugh and we go on, that's not the journalist doing their job, and that's not him doing his job. The assumption should be, when we sit down together, that we are both professionals and that we are both there to do our jobs. And nothing less should be expected, no matter what the power dynamic is. I think too many journalists have a bias toward personality. Because the bottom line is that interesting people make for interesting reading or interesting viewing. And I think that, too, transcends partisan lines. John Caldera is not on TV because journalists love his progressive politics. John Caldera is on TV because he's stinking great TV. All right? Tom Tancredo is not seen as a voice for the right because people love his ideals. It's because he's a fantastic soundbite. He says exactly what he thinks, and then he backs it up. So again, it's this cult of personality. I mean, cult, I don't use it in a pejorative way, but it's this idea that if somebody is interesting, then that's where we've got to go. And I think sometimes that suits the subject well, and sometimes I don't think it suits it well. And lastly, we get to this issue of progress, or change as progress. And I think it's this idea of a progress narrative. And I understand the issue that a lot of conservatives have with that. I will say absolutely that reporters at 9 News and elsewhere gravitate to stories about change. Because change is interesting. Change is impactful. And I will tell you this, the people who are diametrically opposed to you politically know how to pitch their stories as stories of change that is progress. And that is catnip to journalists. And what I see is somebody who gets about 1,000 emails a day, more than half of them story pitches, I see a complete lack of competence from conservatives on how to pitch their story narratives as progress as they see it. It's like it's not in conservatives' dictionary, it's not in their lexicon. And you have to understand that reporters are looking to tell a progress narrative. And quite often what I see is that conservative voices, as well as libertarian voices, are not playing in that space, as if they don't understand that that's what reporters are looking for. So the question becomes, how do we fix the issue? And I would say the same thing to progressives or to liberals or to libertarians or to conservatives. The key is constructive engagement. And there is precious little constructive engagement in terms of addressing issues of bias. And this goes precisely the same for the people who think that journalists are in the pocket of big business as the people who think that journalists are in the pocket of leftist politics. There's so little constructive engagement. The vast majority of emails that I get about media bias start out with some variation of, "You stupid liberal hack." We can have a discussion after. I haven't seen any of your emails in a while, Pete, because you go to my junk folder. So we can have a discussion about media bias off of an email that starts out, you know, "You liberal hack," but it's probably not going to be a promising discussion. Again, you might say, well, that sounds like an outlier. It's not. It's the majority of feedback that I get about media bias, both in personal emails, in comments on 9news.com, in messages that are sent to us in social media, and so forth. The only place I don't get it is face-to-face, because we all know what the anonymity of a keyboard will do to people. So it can't start that way. It has to start with constructive engagement. It has to start with people on the left or on the right picking up the phone or writing an email when they see something that they don't think is balanced and explaining calmly and respectfully how the story could be improved, offering suggestions, offering resources of people that we could talk to. It seems like you might have missed a perspective on this story. I'm sure it was inadvertent. Here's a list of 3 really smart men and women around town who could be a resource for you next time you cover this story. Okay? Those are the emails that we rarely get. So what am I doing on my end if I'm here telling you what to do? I'm trying to convince as many of my colleagues as possible to adopt the model which many journalists practice, that I subscribe to, this idea of acknowledge your own personal biases, get out of this fantasy land that journalists don't have opinions and they don't have their own biases, and check them at the door, check them at the beginning of every story, and then work from there. I'm trying to convince more people to subscribe to that model, and the resistance that I get tends to be, well, I don't let that influence my work. Okay, great, perfect, that's how it should be. How do you go about doing that? Oh, I just don't. Okay, so again, we're talking about deep-seated personal beliefs, and you just kind of like wish them away? How does that work? No. You have to actively focus on it. Like anything else that, you know, takes some doing. You have to focus on it. And the thing is, it has to be this two-way street. I don't think that journalists can fix it on their own, and I don't think that people coming in to the temple of journalism and explaining to journalists how they should do their job can fix it. There's got to be a mindset change on both sides. And the same message goes to progressives who think that the media is sold out to big business and to the status quo and to institutional interest. There has to be that positive engagement. So with that, let's engage. Questions, comments, ideas, this, that, anything else. If I don't know the answer, I'll tell you I don't know the answer. Please don't ask me to defend somebody else's work, because I'd rather not issue a personal opinion on any other journalist in town. You're happy to ask me about my own work, because I should be able to defend it. Yes, ma'am, and back in the way.
Speaking about the interesting quality of a story, is that primarily from the point of view of its being increasing readership and or viewership, so that, because basically it's a matter of selling, so it's...
The question, if I understand it properly, is are stories deemed to be interesting based on the amount of viewers that they will attract and therefore the amount of advertising that will be sold to support the TV station or ads in the paper or whatever else? I think to some extent that is subliminally true. I mean, here's the deal. The for-profit media, if you're not talking about PBS or NPR or something like that, is based on an ad model. At 9 News, there's a downstairs that's based on news, and we work independently of the top floor, which is the sales staff, which sells the ads. They sell the ads that go in between the content. That pays the bills, that pays my salary. I want them to sell ads. Do I have any say in how that's done or anything? No, that would be grounds for termination. But you're asking about the idea of, is eyeballs the measure of interesting?
I think what I'm trying to formulate is between you standing there reading the news and has the management selected those things which will be presented largely on the basis of there being enhanced interest, excitement, controversy, whatever, in order to gain readership or viewership?
The question for anybody who couldn't hear, and I'll try to paraphrase it again correctly, is does management select stories that they know will increase viewership? Is that fair? Okay. I will tell you this, management doesn't select most of the stories that appear on 9 News. Most of them are selected by producers and reporters. Managers have veto power over things that go into and out of newscasts at 9 News. I would also say, and this is one of the reasons why I've stayed at 9 News, I've been there for 6 years and I have no plans to leave. In the shows that I anchor, the 6 and the 9 p.m., I also have veto power over stories, that does not exist every place, not at all. But if a story comes to me and it is so intractably off base, I'll say, it can't run, cannot run. I've done it before. Attracting viewers is obviously the goal. A station that doesn't attract viewers doesn't stay in business. That said, there's an understanding that not everything that's important will be interesting, and not everything that's interesting will be important. There must be a balance of the two. I mean, interesting without important is Entertainment Tonight. And important without interesting is some shows on NPR. So, I don't mean to widely bash NPR because I listen to a lot of NPR and I also think some of it's the best journalism out there. And I think that I hear from a lot of conservatives, I don't listen to NPR, it's liberal. I was like, well, why don't you listen to NPR because it might be good. And that alone might be reason enough to listen to it. But there are some hours that, you know, it's the paint drying hour. So you've got to have the balance. Yes, sir, Ron.
I think on religious bias, I'm under the impression when I listen to the news, Muhammad is always called Prophet Muhammad. When it comes to Jesus, there is no honorable statement. Am I? What would you
like us to say? The question was that Muhammad is referred to in a reverent way, Prophet Muhammad, and there's no such reverence shown for Jesus Christ. What would you prefer?
Jesus Christ, or something that is equivalent to the Prophet Muhammad, because Muhammad wasn't even a prophet.
Well, now you're asking me about something that I know nothing about. I will say this. I mean, there needs to be equal respect shown for different religions. The question is, and again, I work for 9 News in Denver, so I don't do a whole lot of reporting on Jesus. But occasionally it will come up in the sense of various international or national stories. If we're not using terms that you find respectful, tell us. Just call us and just say, last night you said this, and a more respectful way to say it would be this. If it's accurate and respectful, that's what we're going for. So again, it just comes down to, if there's terminology that we could be using, we just need to know what it is.
But you're not under pressure to honor one versus another.
No. Okay, can we put the conspiracy thing to rest here? The conspiracy thing to me is fascinating. Again, I've only worked at a couple of newsrooms. I've only worked on the local level, not the national level. I have never been leaned on by management to alter a story about politics or about religion or about anything else. When I did the interview with President Obama that got so much press because it was shocking that somebody did their job and asked actual questions, every one of those questions, because it was a high-profile interview, every one of those questions went to my news director ahead of time, just because I chose to hand them to her and just be like, hey, listen, here's what I'm going to ask the president. This is a bit more direct than we're used to seeing. Want to make sure that all this passes muster. She did not change a single word in any of the questions. The lone suggestion she made, I was going to ask him the Colorado solar question first and then the Benghazi question, and she said, Benghazi is topical, I haven't heard him answer it, ask Benghazi first. That's the only suggestion that she made. So we asked Benghazi first, and I said, if he doesn't answer, I want to ask him the same question again verbatim to make it clear that he didn't answer. And she said, I'm okay with that, but don't go back a third time. And I said, that's fine with me. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for coming. You're as articulate a person as you are on the news.
Without a teleprompter, might I add. That's not an Obama joke, by the way. That's a news joke. Okay? I have to say that in this room. I don't have to say it in every room.
I want to follow up a little bit on your comment about confirmation bias.
Yep.
Because my suspicion is I concede to everybody here, I have some friends who would be considered part of the Eastern liberal establishment, or the California liberal establishment, and they live in a little bubble. And I suspect that the New York Times and the Washington Post newsrooms pretty much live in that same bubble. And what you get is a herd mentality, because, okay, I lived through Watergate, okay? And all of us who lived through Watergate, every night, the lead story of the news was Watergate, regardless if anything was new or not. Has failed to, has done this, has done that. And I think there's a herd mentality that happens, but it happens only at particular times. Because imagine Watergate had transpired in the Obama administration, or imagine if Fast and Furious had happened in the Nixon administration. Oh my God, the man would have been hung, and he would have been hung on the nightly news. Abu Ghraib, remember the panties on the head in the prison? That was lead story for how many nights on the national news? Imagine had that happened 2 months ago. And vice versa, have Benghazi happened during the Bush administration. And I don't think it's because there's a conspiracy. I think it's because the people there look at it and say, well, this is a great story. We're going to cover this. This is important.
Yeah.
And it's not important if Barack Obama is president. And it's extremely important if Richard Nixon is president. And I really think that's the heart of the problem, is that there's a little tiny bubble that most people operate in. And the bubble that controls most newsrooms, what they're reporting is just the most sensible possible thing in the world. And in fact, it's hopelessly one-sided in terms of what it focuses on. Not necessarily that the New York Times is going to run a third-page story on Benghazi. They will. But what gets focused on every day at the top of the top fold of the paper is the lead story of the news. Would you
You bring up a number of salient points, and let me try to work through them. For starters, on Watergate, I don't have a lot of insight because I was minus 11. In terms of the herd mentality, absolutely. I cannot speak to the national picture because I don't work in those newsrooms, and I don't want to impugn somebody else's motives if I haven't worked with them personally. I will say, though, the herd mentality absolutely exists in local media. And I will say this, as much as I love Twitter and I'm on Twitter all day long, Twitter is the worst thing that has happened for the herd mentality in the press, because now you have people writing stories who are talking to each other constantly as they write the story. There were some things written in the conservative blogosphere here in town recently about a story that I did late last week about the magazine ban and just how sweeping the magazine ban signed this morning by the governor actually is. And there were a lot of pot shots taken at the Capitol Press Corps in the reporting or the blogging about my reporting, basically suggesting that there's a herd mentality there. I think there is. I don't think it's exclusive to the Colorado Capitol. I think it happens on all kinds of beats. I think it happens at the scene of a house fire when you have 4 reporters out there. You've got 4 people talking to each other who wrongly believe that they're probably the smartest people in the room. So if they can come to a consensus on what's happened, well, then that's the gospel truth. When what should happen is that everybody should be working independently and in separate areas, should come up with their own conclusions and should bring those forward. I mean, I had a great news director earlier that said, listen, if everybody is jam-packed around one person getting an interview, go find somebody else. We'll hear what was in that interview, and if it was so dang important, we'll go back and get it later. Go get something unique. Go get another perspective. So I think that that herd mentality absolutely exists and it's destructive. Now about the bubble.
How do you engage?
What's that?
How do you engage with that? I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, absolutely. Here's the thing. Journalists need to realize that engaging, that being part of the herd is antithetical to what they want to accomplish, which is unique, original content that gets people to watch or read your media. Why do I care that you have the same article that 4 other people have? Give me something different. Give me a fresh take. Let me hear from some people that I haven't otherwise heard from. Journalists don't realize that it's in their best interest to break out of the herd. The herd is easy. I've been caught up in the herd. I've done it myself. I try to very consciously break it. It's one reason why I enjoy reporting on political issues. I'm not a political reporter. I'm not on the 9 News political team. I think there's a great advantage to me reporting on politics for a couple of reasons. I'm not in the herd, so I'm not as influenced by what other people are doing or saying. And the other thing that's vitally important is I have no access to protect because I have no access. All right, I didn't get the interview with President Obama because I had access. I got the interview with President Obama because there was no expectation that a local news anchor would ask an actual question. Okay? And
when's your next interview with Obama?
Not going to happen. But I would say this. I think that there's great value in people outside the beat covering stories to the bubble, because the bubble is vitally important. Again, I can't speak to the New York Times bubble or to the Washington Post bubble, but I do think that it exists, and I think one reason that it exists is not so much the newsroom itself, but the people who go into the business. If they're coming from similar life perspectives and experiences, then it's very easy for them to kind of all conclude the same thing is happening. Whereas if you have a newsroom that is filled with all kinds of different people with all types of life experiences, people who are 60 and people who are 21 and people who are raised poor and people who are raised with means, that kind of thing, you're going to get different perspectives and it's tougher for that to bubble off. I think one of the other bubbles that's dangerous is the people who choose to live within the sphere created by those media organizations, because those people are not literate consumers of media. And there are people who live in the New York Times bubble, and there are people who live in the Fox News bubble. The people who live in the New York Times bubble cannot understand why anyone would want a magazine with 16 or 17 rounds in it. They just cannot fathom that. And the people who live in the Fox News bubble cannot fathom why the local media did not cover Jessica's Law when it was defeated in the legislature. But we're all sensible people, so we all know that there are a number of reasons why people would want a Glock 17 or a higher capacity magazine. And those of you who actually watch the local media know that the local media did cover Jessica's Law when it went down to defeat and explained why it happened, and that Fox News just chose to cover it 2 weeks later. So people who only watch Fox think that we covered it up. Again, if you choose to live within that bubble, you're not doing yourself any good. I mean, my internet homepage goes something like Huffington Post, Drudge, Mother Jones, National Review Online. So the idea is you have to be a literate media consumer and see what everybody's talking about, see where they overlap, see where they don't overlap, and read all kinds of different things in order to be literate. And we see those bubbles with consumers as well as with the work product. I wish I could give you a better answer on the national media. I haven't worked there, so I can't really speak to their motives. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, well, I did want to thank you for talking to the President about that, and I thought it was
Would you like to thank me for the Mike Kaufman interview, too? I like it when people thank me for both. It makes me feel better. Okay.
So you talked about this media bias. I really want to understand why people weren't asking him about Benghazi directly. Why the mainstream media wasn't?
Dereliction of duty? I don't know.
And what?
It's their job to ask questions. So you ask important questions. I don't know. There were some people asking about it. Jake Tapper at ABC was asking about it. Cheryl Atkinson at CBS was asking about it. So it's not that no one in the media was asking about it. It just it didn't seem commensurate with the situation.
And were you? I mean, were you scared?
Like of a drone strike, or? I mean, most of the emails that I got, and I got some interesting emails from people after that interview, but most people said one of two things. One, you're going to lose your job for that interview. NBC's going to have you fired. NBC has no sway over 9 News. 9 News is locally run and it's owned by Gannett, which is another company. And then the second one is, you're going to get a tax audit. My wife and I had our taxes done this year by somebody else, so we're going to try to head off the audit. I wasn't scared because I knew that the people in charge at 9 News absolutely supported me 100% in asking important, fair questions. They knew exactly how I was going to go about it. And was I frightened of any repercussions from the White House? Again, I have no access there, so I have no access to protect. So that doesn't matter to me. So really, truly, short of a drone strike, there was no threat. So no, the answer is no, and thankfully so. And I will say this, and this is not a commercial for 9 News, but it is absolutely a commercial for 9 News. People are shocked when I tell them that the people in charge at 9 News were 100% behind every question that I asked President Obama, as they were every question I asked Mike Coffin. And they knew about him ahead of time, and they said, go, get answers, be respectful, but get answers. I will say this, the for-profit media is a business. Like any business, it is dependent on the patronage of its customers, its consumers, its viewers. So I would encourage all of you to patronize media that respects you, and don't patronize media that doesn't respect you. And that same message goes for people from the progressive end of the spectrum to the conservative end of the spectrum. Now, that goes with the caveat of, I encourage you to engage if you feel you're being disrespected, and give them an opportunity to earn your business, the same as you would with any other business. You would go to them and you would say, your product is not meeting my standards. Please earn my business. This is how you can earn my business. And then, if you see a media outlet treating you with respect, patronize them. I mean, the number of people that have told me, I loved your interview with President Obama, I saw it on Fox News, I will never watch 9 News, liberal commie bastards. And I'm like, who do you suppose pays my salary? You know? I mean, again, unless you're Pete and you sneak into the White House press room, you're not asking questions of the White House unless you're working for a media outlet. So it does bother me when I hear people say, I like your work, but I will never watch your channel. You're defeating the purpose. You're defeating the purpose. Yes, ma'am?
Well, I appreciate you being here. The point of media literacy, which is the topic of today, is to create discerning critical thinkers in the populace. When you have people who have expectations and bias coming to the media and looking for those things that counter how they feel about things, then the onus is on the media instead of the population. So sometimes the media gets beat up for being biased when it's the population who's looking for trigger words or looking for certain stories that support their preconceived ideas.
There's plenty of blame to go around. Yeah.
Well, sure. And so I appreciate your willingness to come talk about that. How do you feel the population can better become discerning critical thinkers instead of just double thinkers?
Expose yourself to media that you know contains viewpoints that you don't agree with. Better understand the opposing viewpoint. You have to, I mean, honestly, it's just, I mean, I went to Ithaca College, which is a tremendously progressive college. You know, it's one of the, I mean, the joke is, I know they make the joke about Boulder and other places, you know, it's 15 square miles surrounded by reality. You know, it's one of those kinds of places. And I went to college with a lot of people who didn't read anything but Mother Jones and the Onion Reader and things like that, and didn't understand the world outside that. And you see the same thing from people who only watch Fox News. Those were the people who thought Romney was going to win in a landslide. I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, like, that wasn't not quite right. That was an absolute fantasy land. And it was only truly believed by people who had not escaped that bubble, because they heard somebody telling them something that they wished was the truth. So you have to expose yourself to other viewpoints and demand that media that is not overtly ideological, like a National Review or like the Fox opinion shows or like MSNBC. There's no expectation of balance on an MSNBC opinion show. There's no expectation of balance on Hannity. They bring on some punching bag and they punch them up and they're done. There's no expectation of balance there. But there should be from 9 News or from the Denver Post. So demand balance in the media that should be balanced and expose yourselves to media that is intentionally ideological.
Kyle, exactly as 9 News pays your salary, student tuitions pay ours. So let's be a college for a few minutes and come on over here, take some questions from the students.
All right, let's do it. Yes, sir.
How you doing?
I'm doing well.
Well, stand up and introduce yourself, would you please?
My name's Paul Smith. I'm a communications major here at CCU. I'm a senior.
That's the way.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, so we know what the responses were from people who had come to you about Mike Kaufman or President Obama. I want to know what your colleagues, other folks in your field felt about how you addressed President Obama or Mike Kaufman. Were they on your side? Did they back you up? Or was it more of the folks who were like, oh, I don't have a bias, I can put that away? Were they more angry? I just want to know, do you feel supported in your field and how you represented yourself with those two particular?
That is a tremendously good question. I did not receive any negative pushback for either interview from other journalists, for the Kaufman interview or for the Obama interview. I will say the positive response from other journalists was far greater on the Kaufman interview, which I think is just a reflection of the fact that there are more liberals and conservatives in the media. And again, these are not people who are on air with me giving me high fives. And we're talking about people, I mean, again, journalists are allowed to have personal feelings and personal conversations, and a lot of people are like, yeah, way to go, you stuck it to Mike Kaufman. It's like, well, I wasn't sticking it to anybody, I was asking questions. And a lot of people, you know, a fair number of people were like, wow, you really stuck it to the president. And again, it wasn't sticking it to anybody, just asking tough questions. But there was a balance. I felt no blowback, no pressure about how dare you, or how could you, or what were you doing, or anything like that on either one of those interviews. Another student question? I'll do a bunch in a row here. Yes, sir.
Hey, Pierce Richardson. So as far as media bias, I mean, what is the one thing to look for, like, as a viewer watching the news to tell when media bias is happening? And also, I mean, you kind of make it sound like local news and like 9 News doesn't have media bias, but
I think everybody has media bias. Go ahead. I'm sorry if that wasn't the end of
well,
your
I
question.
mean, yeah, that was. You just answered.
No, I think that bias exists everywhere, inside, outside the media, in all kinds of different fields and different areas and everything else. I mean, I would say this: if you are going out hunting for media bias, you will find it every single time. The question to ask whenever you watch a story is, did they provide context? Did they fairly represent both sides? The question is not, well, that's media bias because I heard something I didn't like. You should hear something you don't like in most every story. You should also hear something that gels with your way of thinking if the story is done well. And the shorter the story, the more devoid of context it's going to be, but the more devoid of hyper-partisan statements it needs to be. If I'm doing a 25-second story about a bill signing on gun control this morning, and it's only 25 seconds, I'm not summarizing both arguments for and against. I'm just stating the fact of what's happening. But any story that goes in depth about how one group of people feels about the issue also needs to go into equal depth about how other folks feel about it. So that's what you should look for. Anytime you see something and you go, well, that's a clear statement of opinion or a belief system. Was the other belief system represented? And if it wasn't, pick up the phone, write an email, just very respectfully. Hey, I didn't see this in the story. I'm wondering, did you cover this some other time? Was that covered on a previous day? I will tell you the vast majority of emails we get about media bias are hostile, if not profane, and it's very difficult to have a conversation with people. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Another student question if we have one? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Alex Coffey, sophomore year. What advice do you have for the future generation going into the media industry?
Ask tough, fair questions of people and do it every single time. Because the first time that you don't do it, then you open yourselves up to people doubting what you do. But if you always ask tough, fair questions, the people that you talk to will expect that every time, and there will be no surprise. Again, the reason why the Obama team allowed him to do an interview with me is because they had zero expectation that I would ask an actual question. If they had Googled me, they would have figured out that I would have, and I probably wouldn't have gotten the interview. That said, when I deal with people here locally, they know that I'm going to ask them a challenging question. They also know that I'm not just going to print something because they give it to me. And there are other reporters in town who do that, by the way, who do a very good job of pushing back on the idea of, oh, well, you gave me a statement, so I'm going to print it. Why? Did it answer the question? Did it provide anything of substance? You know, it's like when whenever I see in a script, you know, somebody saying, you know, customer safety is our #1 priority. Well, sure as hell better be. I mean, so I take that out of the script. What's that doing in there? Tell us something about what happened, you know? Tell us something that's meaningful, you know? Politicians that say that they care about things. I don't care that you care. What have you done? Like, let's talk about do. Give me a statement about do, and I'll put that in the story. So my advice to you would just be very consistent with the idea that I'm going to come at somebody with tough but fair questions every single time out of the gate, and that's just what I'm going to be known for. And if that means that you lose an interview opportunity to somebody who's going to come in and who's going to play softball, so be it. You didn't want that interview, and it will be okay. I've lost out on plenty of opportunities because I was deemed to not be sufficiently sympathetic. Whatever.
Building on her question, what would be your advice to our students, Kyle, who want to break in to media and journalism and then want to advance and achieve some things as you've been able to do?
Absolute key is internships and getting in early. I didn't necessarily need an internship because I started at an ag radio station when I was 15, and when I turned 16 and I was legal to work, they gave me all my back pay. I mean, the key is just to get your foot in the door. Just prove that you can do it. We've hired a ton of former interns at 9 News for all kinds of things, and it's just people that we knew could do. Because at the bottom line, I mean, you don't need a license to practice journalism. And I know somebody in the room is going to be like, you should. Trust me, you don't want that system. No, you don't want that system. So the idea is just get in, prove that you can do it, and you can get hired. And that's what I did. So I started working in ag radio when I was 15. I started just kind of working behind the scenes there. Buddy of mine and I used to sit up in the bleachers at our small town high school, and we would pretend to do calls of the basketball games onto a tape recorder just to practice. And then one day the guy who did that for the local radio station resigned. And I just went to the boss and I said, how about giving me a shot? And he said, you're 15. And I'm like, it's radio. Like, they can't see me. So he said, we'll give you a shot, and it worked out okay, and then I did that, and then when I went off to school, the other thing too is that you've got to be prepared to work harder than other people because it's a profession that a lot of people want into and will work very hard to do. You can't start out as a 5-day-a-week kind of thing. When I was in school, freshman and sophomore years, I worked on the assignment desk behind the scenes at a CBS affiliate near my hometown. I drove an hour and a half each weekend to go work, stayed at my parents' house or a friend's house, worked, and then came back to school on Monday. I missed a lot of really great parties. But my friends who can't hold a job in the business and are having trouble supporting their families now, do you wish you'd worked a little bit harder in college? I'm guessing some of them do. And then my senior year of college, I went down to part-time student status to finish up, and I worked 5 days a week, and I took classes 2 days a week. So I had a 7-day week. Do it while you have the energy to do it, because the energy will fade fast. I'm 29, and I don't think I have the energy to do it. So do the 7-day-a-week thing while you can, and push it to get you ahead of other people. But again, it's a glamour profession, which is one of the reasons why it's so screwed up. Because it's something that people think is glamorous and fabulous, and it shouldn't be if done correctly. But you need to work your way ahead of those people in line, so just outwork them. Yes, sir.
I've been a candidate for Republican offices before. I'm very interested in your comment about engaging the media in a positive way. Can you give us some examples, besides emails or posting on your webpage, how to personally get to know some of these people and engage them?
I think a lot of that starts with just engaging them in a conversation about day-to-day stories. Tell them when you think they've done a good job. Tell them when you think they haven't done a good job. Just respectfully engage with people ahead of time. I'll say the way the media works, at least here in Denver, is that very few political races actually get covered in TV news. Most of it's done with local newspapers and things like that. But I would just say develop that relationship ahead of time just as somebody that they know. If they just know your name, I mean, that's helpful. And it doesn't mean, ingratiate yourself by telling them how wonderful they are all the time. We don't need that. We get enough of that from people who aren't super discerning about intellectual matters. But it's this, just be a known quantity. Just engage and be a known quantity is what I would say. Yes, ma'am.
This
This almost might be more of a style sheet sort of a question, but I think it's really important. When I was a kid back in the 70s and TV was first impacting me, and you'd hear news stories, and it was the time of the Basque separatists in Spain and the IRA in Ireland, and the newscasters would say the IRA took credit for the bombing of the whatever. It was always took credit, no matter what the atrocity was. And finally they got away from that, and now it's now it's take responsibility. I'd like to see it move to a more pejorative sort of thing, and that might be either your drone strike or your breakup item to find and see if you could work it in. Find a pejorative way to say, I would love for it to be X admits guilt in, but that probably is over the top. What do you think?
I would have to disagree with you. I think that our best bet is to use the most accurate term possible that's also value neutral. That's not to say that when horrible things are done that we don't acknowledge that they're horrible, but again, that's not really our job. People at home know that it's horrible. This is why it bothers me when newscasters over-emote, like we don't know how to feel about a story. Like, you don't need to be sad on air. I get it. It's a sad story. And I also don't know that we need to use terms that are pejorative because people at home know that someone killing innocent people is a heinous thing to do. I mean, a few years ago, didn't Fox News try to come up with a new term for suicide bombings? They wanted to call them homicide bombings or something like that. And it just seemed forced in the end. It just never worked, it never connected. People know what a suicide bombing is. It's some guy who straps a vest to himself and goes and blows up little kids. I mean, again, I don't know that it necessarily needs a pejorative. I think it needs accurate descriptions. And I think that it needs an accurate depiction of the way that it impacts people. That would be my take on that.
But for children, when they hear that, take responsibility, we tell them all the time, take responsibility for what you do. So that almost gets a negative connotation for me.
I think that parents play a great role in media literacy, among other things, and I think that it's important at that point for an adult to step in and say, "You understand the context in which they're using this. They're not condoning this. They're just explaining that that's who's claiming responsibility." Yes, sir.
Kyle, you just mentioned media literacy, and got me thinking about literacy in general. And doing the job you do, you have to be knowledgeable about just a myriad of things. And as we watch television or read newspapers, we're constantly bombarded with people who don't know a thing about what they're talking about. So I'm just curious, what was the last book that you read?
Boy, what am I reading right now? I do a couple at the same time because I read different types of things for different reasons. Right now I'm reading a book about the Copperhead movement during the Civil War in northern Pennsylvania, the anti-Lincoln crowd, because I plan to write a short biography just for people in my family of a member of our family who was involved in that movement. He was a Civil War draft dodger. So I'm reading that to learn more about that. I'm a big history buff, I'm a big genealogy fan, so I want to know more about that so I can speak to people in my family about it reasonably. I just reread not Ambrose, McCullough's Path Between the Seas, The Building of the Panama Canal, which is a fascinating book because I love the idea of big undertakings. I loved his book on the Brooklyn Bridge as well, because so often we hear that, yeah, we can't do big things, or big things cost a lot of money, or that's crazy, or whatever else. A lot of crazy stuff has turned out to be pretty awesome. So I enjoy reading about fantastic endeavors like that. That's what I'm reading now, and then some Stephen King, because it amuses me.
So Tom McAdam, he nailed you. You thought it was going to be something lightweight like chicken soup for the lonely anchorman, didn't you? Nobody has one-upped Kyle Clark yet. And Kyle, let's say if you want to make a little closing statement, maybe there's something you haven't done or said. If you'd like to tell us how much you care, or that consumer safety is your #1 priority.
Yeah.
Maybe you've got something you'd like to over-emote about. Just wrap it up for us, if you would.
I would just say engage constructively, and that also goes for telling us and telling other media outlets in town when you see something that you like. Hey, I've been critical of you guys in the past, but I thought you did a good job on this. and constructively engage when you see something that you don't like. And again, I cannot stress enough, and this is just a pleading for my own paycheck, patronize media businesses that treat you with respect, and don't patronize the ones that don't, and tell them about that, because that will have an impact. Again, it's a business. If no one is watching, the business will cease to exist. It's in their best interest to be in business, so tell them why they are or are not earning your business.
All right, before we thank our guest, I want to present a gift to him. Lots of you know that around Christmas, Centennial Institute thought that it would be great to pick an eye-catching color. How many cars do you see of this color every day? And put 1776 on it as sort of the American exceptionalism tie. And I give this to you with a caveat, Kyle. You may want to also find a British exceptionalism and Greek exceptionalism tie to wear with it. We'll be looking for those. Yes. But in the meantime, here is your Centennial Institute tie. And we thank you very much.
It's certainly the 17th magazine, but it's not. I appreciate it.
Monday, April 15th, a debate, Are People the Problem? Environmentalist Phil Cafaro of the CSU faculty will debate Robert Zubrin, space scientist, energy expert. Are people the problem? Around the theme of whether population control and radical cutbacks in carbon emissions are called for. You won't want to miss that. It'll be next door in Beckman Monday evening. We're back to Issue Monday on Monday, April 15. You'll also be hearing soon about something we call Conservative Persuasion Boot Camp. Conservative Persuasion Boot Camp. It's 3 hours with Bill Kristol and Stephen F. Hayes of the Weekly Standard and Fox News. Speaking of Fox News, they're doing a conference in Colorado Springs at the Broadmoor, and Centennial Institute has lassoed them for a Friday afternoon of interactive workshop, how you more effectively articulate what you believe in and engage with those who may need persuading or may disagree with you. Conservative Persuasion Boot Camp, Friday afternoon, May 3rd at the Broadmoor. We'll be telling you more about all of that. We're adjourned for now, and we again thank our very special guest, Kyle Clark.